Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. So glad you can be joining us. This is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking this week with Representative Michelle Bos-Lun, who is from Wyndham 3, or represents Wyndham 3, which if you're not sure which towns those are, that's Rockingham, Westminster, and is it all of Brookline or just a little bit of Brookline,
All
Michelle?
of Brookline, but Brookline only has 550 people, so it's not that much. No offense to the good people of Brookline. It's a small town.
Well, I'm so glad you could be joining us today, Michelle.
Glad to be here.
Um, Michelle serves on the House Committee on Agriculture, Food Resiliency, and Forestry, which is your first term on this committee, and you were two terms on Corrections and Institutions before
That's
that.
correct. That's correct.
What was that like, making a shift to a whole new committee? Like that must have required a whole new base of knowledge and
Yeah,
everything.
it's true. There were a lot of changes, but they were actually, honestly, they were pretty welcome changes. I mean, the first two terms that I was on Corrections and Institution, I really enjoyed the part that was related to corrections policy. I have a background in restorative justice, and that's why I had actually put that committee on my list of places that I might like to work. But honestly, doing the capital budget and hearing testimony for hours and hours about infrastructure projects and um, new roofs on courthouses and parking garages in Burlington, like that just really wasn't my interest area. I'm interested in people and how to make their lives good and the environment. And the stuff that like the pipes and the buildings, that just wasn't my interest area. So I was really glad to move into ag and food. And I'm getting to help figure out how to help farmers and feed people. And that really is something I feel much more passionate about. And it's a very welcome change. I've always loved food and farms, but now I get to work on that in the State House. And I'm really grateful for that opportunity.
Well, and I'm looking forward. We'll be talking about a couple of the bills you worked on later in the show, so I'm looking forward to hearing more about those.
Yeah.
Before we get to those, I'd love to hear just your thoughts on this session, especially I feel like we've had over the past few years, we had the COVID session, and then coming out of COVID and all the leadership changes and new representatives. So it feels like the legislature has been undergoing a bit of churn and just upheaval lately. Even though we had the big ed bill that everyone was focusing on, it did feel to me like maybe this session wasn't quite a new normal, but maybe not as much upheaval. But I'm wondering if that was your experience.
I would say that this session definitely felt different than my previous sessions. I mean, I've been in, this is my third session that I've been elected for. The first one was COVID, so I was online for my first year. And then my second session, we had the supermajority, and that made a different kind of vibe because really, whatever we collectively worked on in the committees, we almost certainly were able to pass. And if the governor didn't agree, we could override. And so that made a certain kind of tone that
Mm.
made things easy for the Democrats. And I am a Democrat, and I do vote with the Democrats the majority of the time, though not always. Sometimes I'm a bit of a rebellious Democrat, but that's okay. I think it's actually good to not 100% vote with the party. I have a critically thinking mind, and sometimes it goes with the party and sometimes it doesn't. But I do feel like this time overall in the House, there were at times it felt there were times it felt divisive for sure.
Hmm.
You would have an issue and things had almost 100% a partisan vote. And I just find it hard to believe that really 100% of the Democrats feel one way and 100% of the Republicans don't. And I think sometimes people just follow leadership, they follow the governor, they follow the speaker, they follow the pro tem. And I don't feel that's the way to make good policy. I think we make better policy when we meet and talk and thresh through ideas in all kinds of different settings. And then we vote about what we think is right. And, that happens in lots of different ways where we do meet and talk about ideas, not just vote in divisive ways on the floor, like in caucuses or in committees. But it didn't always translate to the full House chamber this time, and that was a bit discouraging because there were really important bills like the housing bill, which was supposed the emergency housing bill H91, which was supposed to replace the hotel housing program, and it passed in the House with some Republican support, but not enough to override the veto, and the governor vetoed it. So we weren't able to accomplish that. And that was a really important policy that has needed looking at for a long time. So there has been some discouraging parts to serving in this new model.
Hmm. It's interesting you say that, Michelle, because I've been sitting with what at the time was a throwaway comment in a conversation I had with John Walters, who's a journalist
Mm-hmm.
behind the Vermont Political Observer.
Yep.
And I don't remember exactly what we were talking about, but kind of this, the supermajority versus voting along party lines. And I said at the time that, at the end of the day, who's ever representing us, ideally, in my Olga's little universe, would vote for vote to reflect the people of their district or their county or whoever has elected them. And the party hasn't elected them. The governor hasn't elected them.
Mm-hmm.
The people of their district did. And I
Mm-hmm.
sort of teased myself saying, I know that's so naive, blah, blah, blah. And maybe it still is, but the more I've been sitting with that, the more I'm feeling that that's really important.
Mm-hmm.
That reps,
Yeah.
try as best they can reflect the people of who elected them.
Yeah.
And I realize sometimes you need to go a different way for a whole host of reasons, but not because the governor's going that way or not
Yeah.
because your party's going that way, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know. Having said that, does that jiggle anything loose for you or?
Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, when I was first elected, I had really wise legislators who had been in office much longer than me tell me the three things you need to consider when you're before you make a vote is your conscience, your constituents, and your caucus. And your caucus meaning your political caucus, which I guess wouldn't be relevant if you're an independent, but for everybody else, we have a caucus, and not necessarily in that order. I mean, for me, the conscience is the one that you have to live with your conscience. And so, like, I voted against the budget a couple of years ago because I didn't want to unhouse 300 people from motel housing, and that was voting against my caucus. But it was, I think, the right decision, and my constituents actually supported that for the most part. Um, but I do think there are times where the constituent versus caucus issue gets muddled for some folks, and like I was one of those folks that voted against the education bill in the first and the second version, because I was concerned about its impact on rural schools, and I heard from, I would say 95%. I heard from one person who wanted me to vote for it, and every other person that I got, and that was 25 letters, so 25 messages. So I don't know what that makes my math. Maybe it was 4% or 5% said yes and 95% no. But people wanted me to vote no. They didn't like this bill. The NEA didn't like this bill. Teachers didn't like this bill. Parents didn't like this bill. I have never had so many people tell me to vote against something who, for the most part, were people who supported me, who are in touch with me, who share my values. And it would have been for me a very hard, if I had strongly felt that this bill was the right fit, it would have been hard for me to vote yes, knowing that overwhelmingly the people in my district, that's not what they wanted. And I think a lot of Democrats had to wrestle with this because we all were getting those messages. And
Mm,
yet there were some Democrats who voted for the bill, there were some who voted against it. And either way, it feels hard because a lot of people have worked hard and put good thought into making it work. And there are things that are good in every bill, almost every bill. But in the end, you have to just think, what do I think is the best for the people of Vermont, and what is the best for my district, and then see where that lands.
mm,
But it's not easy. It's not like it. I mean, some people will automatically vote with the caucus. I absolutely will not automatically vote with the caucus. I mean, in general, I think the caucus is likely to be on the same page as me the huge majority of the time. But it's not automatic. I need to think about it. I need to talk to people in my district, um, and then figure out what's the right call.
hmm. Were there any other bills this session that you had that much to sit with before you
That
voted?
that was absolutely the hardest one. Yeah, that was the hardest one, the ed bill, that had some tax policy implications as well. Yeah, I don't think any of the rest were that divisive.
Hmm. And I realize we're not too far out of the session. It really only adjourned when you think about it, what, 2, 3 weeks
Less
ago?
than 2 weeks ago, June 16th was our
June
last
16th,
day.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so I know you haven't had a lot of time to sit, but what so far has been any other takeaways or anything that you're sitting with that you're like, okay, we need to ponder this a little bit more?
Well, I mean, sort of in the big picture, the thing that I came away from this session being aware of more than anything else was that politics can work if you get the right people in the room and they get to really listen and work with each other. And I think about my committee in particular as an example for that. So my committee has 8 people. It's agriculture committee. We have 3 farmers on the committee. We have 3 Republicans on the committee. We have 4 Democrats and 1 independent. And we voted out, I think, all but one bill we voted out unanimously. And it wasn't because it was a rubber stamp. It was because we listened deeply to each other. We talked to each other. We built trust and respect with one another so that even when we weren't in session, if we were having a conversation and we got there early and I was chatting with one of my colleagues, and some of the Republicans on my committee are very conservative. I mean, I have colleagues who have introduced all kinds of legislation to roll back environmental policies that I was co-signers for. Like, it's not like these people were naturally simpatico with me on all things political. But in that committee, we listened and learned and talked about and looked at the consequences, and we voted everything out together, including things like, should we recommend to appropriations that, yes, we want to keep universal school meals in the budget, even though the governor didn't want to do it? And we were 100%, every person in that room, we want universal school meals. And we were like that on all of these. And some of these are the things that we vote on are bills that impact food insecure individuals who are getting government, you could say government handouts or policies that are funded by the government to help their food insecurity. And 100% we were able to listen to each other and work together. And I found that actually translated into a really positive phenomena outside of the committee as well. I mean, there were bills that I never in a million years would have thought I would get Republican co-signers for. And some of my colleagues are like, I'll sign that. I'll introduce that bill with you. I co-signed things that they did. In fact, some of my Republican colleagues voted for things that other of their Republican colleagues did not vote for. And I don't know that it was because of any one conversation, but I think we had this experience of listening and talking to each other and really thinking about the consequences that made us not just think, oh, we need to vote our party, we need to vote for what's right. And I wish that really intensive relationship building, deep listening kind of experience could get somehow transformed and applied on a wider scale, because I think it would really serve democracy well. But I
Well,
was hopeful. I was hopeful to see that it could work in a small, because honestly, my last committee was not that cohesive. This was the most cohesive I've ever seen a political committee work. And it was really a pleasure to be a part of that.
well, that's interesting because, as you were talking, one of the things that came to mind for me, and I think you highlighted it, even mentioning your 2 separate experiences on 2 different committees, is like, how did you get to that place of really listening, of talking about consequences? Was there expectation setting at the beginning of the session? Was it just luck? Like, what do you think happened to make that really great relationship?
Yeah, it's hard to say exactly. I mean, I certainly went in there with a little bit of a bad attitude when I looked at these people and I didn't know them and I looked at their voting, where they were coming from. I thought, oh my goodness, how is this ever going to work? This is going to be so divisive. We're going to be like Washington. So I had a little bit of a bad attitude before I got there, honestly. But once I got there, they're just nice people, and they are all guys. So I can say they're nice guys. The Republicans on my committee are all guys. So is the independent. There are only 2 women on the committee, myself and one other woman who's a Democrat. Um, but I just feel like the committee chair is David Durfee, and he sets a very gentle tone. I think he presents ideas and then asks for opinions, and nobody on my committee is shy to voice their opinions, but they also are able to listen to each other. And so I think really quickly we started out at the very first thing we did was listening to a lot of testimony around school meals. And it was something that impacted farmers. It was something that impacted people living in poverty. And that was something that we all care about. We all have farmers and we all have kids and we all have people living in poverty. And we all want people in Vermont to have food. So, with that common value, we were able to look at and listen to how can we work together to make sure this works. And the more we heard in terms of testimony that affirmed that this was a good idea, the more we ended up just kind of naturally getting onto the same page. So I don't know, David Durfee maybe picked really carefully great people to come in and do testimony, but it does feel like the pieces fell into place and then set the stage for future issues, which we weren't always 100% on the same page to begin with, but we generally got there. And I think it was partly that the chair set the tone, but I also think it was this common vision of food farms and forests. We want to do what's right for Vermont, and that was like front and center. Whereas I think sometimes on the House floor, it's like, oh, we don't want to make the governor look bad. Oh, we want to stand up for the speaker. Sometimes party can get in the way on the House floor. And in the committee, we really were able to just look at the issues. And I wish overall that happened in politics more, that we could just look at the issues and let those labels fall away. Because we weren't elected to represent a party. We were elected to represent people, and people have diverse views.
Mm-hmm. Was there anything with your committee work that maybe you started out at one place and then as the conversation went on and you learned more, you changed to another perspective? Did that happen? And can you share with us what that
Yeah,
was
I mean, I
like?
wouldn't say 100% that happened, but there was an issue. There was a bill that we passed, which was called the the nickname for the bill was the right to farm. It really wasn't exactly about right to farm, but it was about being able to file nuisance lawsuits against farmers for a variety of things.
Mm,
And in some cases, that can be really important. So, like, for example, we heard about somebody who was a farmer and they were having a hard time making ends meet, and they wanted to open a pick your own strawberry patch. And their neighbors complained, like, oh, that's going to make too much traffic. We don't want you to do that in terms of zoning. You shouldn't have a business. You're just a farmer. And it was a lot of problems. And they just wanted pick your own, you know? And there were other places that were similar things like that. They want to build a farm stand, and people object to the farm stand for them to sell their products. Well, if we want to have farmers producing products in Vermont, we have to make it so that they can make a living. And I actually have started a small farmers market booth this summer since the session adjourned. And it is hard to make a living selling food, I can tell you that. And so I started out a little bit concerned about the right to farm bill. Well, more than a little bit concerned, because there is also this other side where if there's an environmental issue, somebody might be protected. They can say, oh, I have runoff from my dairy farm and the sewage is going into the river, but I have the right to farm, so you can't sue me. And so I
mhm,
was like, ooh, is that what's going to happen? And so I started out, I would say, pretty cautious about the right to farm bill because of the potential environmental problems that could be caused if it was too broad. But what I realized over time, and in the end, that was one of the bills that did not pass unanimously. It passed 7-1. We had one person that voted against it, and 7 of us voted yes. But in the end, what I felt like was overall, this was going to help farmers, and it wasn't going to let people get away with doing things that were egregious. There still was language in there to protect if there's an environmental violation, if there's a problem that should not be happening. It's not like you're going to get a free pass to do anything. It just means that you can't be stopped of doing reasonable things to make a living as a farmer. And so in the end, I did end up supporting that.
interesting, interesting. Yeah, I think I could see how if there was an environmental issue, that would actually fall under a whole other set of laws.
Well, and a lot of these things are so complicated, you know, that there's water quality laws. And yeah, I mean, there are many, many different possibilities. But I mean, I wanted to make sure that when I voted yes for that bill, it wasn't going to have unintended consequences. And my impression is that we're actually going to be helping farmers, not hurting them, and the
Mhm.
community as well. So I hope we're right about that. It did pass almost unanimously. There were a few no votes, but it passed by a strong margin in both the House and the Senate.
Mhm. Any other thoughts on the session that you think would be good for people to consider, know?
Well, I guess I would just say one thing in general, and I think you probably would hear this from almost anybody who was in office this year, was just that the financial reality of the world we're working in right now, both post COVID. So all of those COVID monies that were coming in and giving us the opportunity to all kinds of great project, that money's gone. And some of the money, even that was promised from that era, is now being pulled because of the rather extreme federal chaos that's going on right now, where federal funding is being pulled from programs that we really rely on. And we saw that in our committee. We saw that related to housing. We saw that in so many different areas. The money being pulled from the feds makes it very difficult for us to figure out how to fund things here in the state. Because often we will fund maybe 2/3 of a project we fund by the state, and then 1/3 of it comes from the feds. Well, if the feds aren't going to put their third in, we don't have enough money to do it. So what are we going to do? And so we spent a lot of time kind of trying to guess, are we really going to get to keep the Fed money? Are we not going to keep the Fed money? But I think people need to understand that we're in this state of flux right now with the Trump administration that's causing an awful lot of chaos. Same thing with the tariffs. We heard a lot of testimony in my committee around tariffs and how disruptive those would be for farmers and small businesses here in Vermont. And it was like one day the tariffs are on, one day the tariffs are off. And it's really hard for people to know. So it's hard for us to make policy. It's hard for people to understand as small businesses how to move forward. So just it's going to be a long 3.5 more years. And hopefully we'll get into a rhythm where there'll be a bit more predictability, but it's very hard to govern when you don't know if your reliable sources of income are still going to be there.
Mm. I've been hearing this from a lot of the business owners I speak to as well for work, and they've said something similar, and it's really made me think about um, the last few years, not just the Trump administration, but COVID too, of how our governmental process, at least what I see as the outside looking in, is supposed to be slow and deliberate
Mm-hmm.
so that you can do what you were talking about earlier, get as many people at the table as possible, get your testimony,
Yep.
get your knowledge base going,
Yep.
think about consequences.
Yep.
And that chaos is really something our system um, still needs some resiliency around, because it looks like it's coming heavy and fast from multiple directions, more in the past few years since COVID, at least than in my memory.
Yes, I would say that's true. And I would say since January, it's been like 4 times because of all the pulling from all the federal funds. So, like, just within my committee, the USDA funds that were cut nationally impacted all kinds of different programs for local purchasing that was going to bring food from local farms to schools, to food banks, to all kinds of different folks. And once that USDA money is gone, how do we do that? We don't have the funds to make up the difference. And we've got folks that are going to be hungry, and we've got farmers that aren't going to make it because they don't have the money for those programs. And it's hard. And that's like the tiniest little sliver of, God forbid, when they vote on the big horrible bill, if that thing goes through, what are we going to do with Medicaid if the funds are cut from Medicaid? How are we going to meet people's medical needs here in Vermont? I don't know, because we don't have enough in the state funds to pay for it, and the feds usually do a large portion of that. So it's hard. This is not an easy time to be a legislator.
I can imagine. Well, and just on the examples you gave right there, people's health, people's ability to access food, and then farmers producing food is both feeding people, but it's also part of our economy. So
True.
you hit health, food, and economy, and
Yeah.
just very small examples right there.
Yeah, and money was taken from housing vouchers. So folks who are housing insecure, who get housing, if their housing vouchers taken away, they may lose their housing as well. Well, then what? We've
Mhm.
already got a huge problem with people who are unhoused in the state. What are we going to do if all the vouchers are gone? There's just a lot that's really daunting to think about. Um, yeah.
Well, yeah, and unfortunately, these problems are not happening in the vacuum within the Vermont borders.
Mhm.
So if it's hitting us, it's hitting a
Everybody.
lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have just a few minutes before we need to hear from some underwriters, kind of focusing on this upheaval and idea of chaos and how to be a legislature. How did you sort of, like, how did you find your center in all of this? How did you keep your sanity, basically?
Well, that was
Oh,
challenging.
she's laughing.
More challenging this year than others. Let's just say that. I think, honestly, I think the caucuses really help. I mean, I'm
Mhm.
a part of a lot of caucuses. I go to the Rural Caucus, which is a very multi-party caucus that looks at issues impacting rural communities. I go to the Women's Caucus. I go to the Public Health Caucus. I go to the Democratic Caucus. And when you're in caucuses, you're with these people who are kind of like I was talking about with my committee. You've got a common purpose and you're looking at a goal and how are we going to meet that goal? And the Democratic caucus is a little bit different because it's more just sharing of bills and hearing about how bills are moving forward. But with the other issue based caucuses, it's a chance to sit and talk and listen and communicate around complex ideas and ask questions that help to clarify things and also build connections between people. So then
Mhm.
afterwards, you can go follow up and like, hey, can I sit with you? I want to follow up on that thing you said in the rural caucus, and to me, that's really important. Having relationships with people so that I can follow up outside of the formal meetings is really essential. Um, and even just like going out to supper with somebody after a meeting, you need a little time to debrief and process some of what we're doing together because it is sometimes just such a surreal and complicated world that I have a small like a text group of like 17 legislators, and we often will write back and forth like, what's going on with this, do you understand this? And it really helps to just feel like you have a little sub community of people you can bounce ideas off and get reinforced and encouraged by. And so that does help with the keeping steady. Things feel like you're going to lose your footing and you're like, oh wait, I'm not the only one, we'll figure this out together.
Oh, thank you, Michelle. So, folks, we're going to hear from some underwriters here on WVEW, LP Brattleboro, but hang tight. Michelle Bos-Lun, the Montpelier Happy Hour, and I will be back in a moment. Hello, beautiful people. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. If you're just joining us, I'm Olga Peters, the host and producer of the show, and I'm speaking with Representative Michelle Bos-Lun, who represents Wyndham 3, and that is Rockingham, Westminster, and Brookline. And we've been just gathering Michelle's thoughts on this session that just passed. Thank you for being here, Michelle.
Glad to be here.
Before we dive back into our conversation, I just want to thank BCTV for taking the video version of this show and sharing it with media centers around the state, as well as reminding people that the views and opinions of those on the Montpelier Happy Hour belong to the host and the guests, no one else, not the platforms, not the radio station, like just no one but us. But if you ever want to take issue with that, you can send an email to the montpelierhappyhour@gmail.com. And I would love to hear your opinions. So, Michelle, diving back into the show, before in the first half, we were talking about just your thoughts on the session. And I think the word that kept coming up for me was relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we're about to dive in and talk about some legislation you worked on, but before we do that, I would just like to revisit that concept of relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And, I always find it interesting being in Vermont. We're such a small state that so often it's not even 6 degrees of separation, it's like maybe half a degree.
Mm-hmm.
And so, some things about that are really wonderful. And some things sometimes can be a little hard because you're not necessarily anonymous,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, or maybe you don't have a lot of buffer
Mm-hmm.
between you and other people. I'm wondering for you, how do you kind of balance that close relationship with also our natural needs for boundaries, or in your case with the legislature, there is a little bit of a hierarchy. Um, yeah, what's that for you?
Hmm. Well, I mean, in my life before I was a legislator, I worked both in social services and education. But I always worked in kind of funky places. So like I worked at youth services with kids who were unhoused and help them find housing. And I was a case manager at Groundworks and help people who didn't have housing try and find housing. And as a teacher, I worked in funky independent schools, like where kids would do experiential education, and I would like take them to China as well as teach them about Chinese history and that kind of thing. So I always have worked in places that have kind of, I think it's fair to say, flexible boundaries, where sometimes you just have to give the kid a ride because nobody else is going to give them a ride. Mm-hmm. And it's a little different than like in a public school. The rules are much firmer, I think, than in a lot of the places that I've worked. And so I guess I feel like in my legislative life, it's kind of like that too, where, I mean, my mailing address for political or other things, my only phone that I have is my personal phone. My address is where I live. And I'm okay with that. I mean, it's like people know this is where I live. This is who I am. Occasionally, I have had some harassment on my property. I've had signs stolen from my yard. I've had Black Lives Matter signs cut down from my yard. I've had people take tables that were full of vegetables and back trucks into them and ruin the tables. Like, wow. I mean, call them like mini hate crimes. I've had that, which I'm pretty sure is related to politics, mm-hmm. but nobody ever sent me a message with it. They just occasionally have done nasty things. And while I'm not a fan of that, I do think that the huge majority of the people in my district, in my community in Vermont, are good people, mm-hmm. and they appreciate that I'm trying to do good work. And so I always I'm sort of a glass half full, or see the best in people, even if they sometimes treat you rotten. And so I'm a forgiving person who keeps trying even when things are hard. And I think that works well in the legislature, because a lot of times things are hard and a lot of times things hurt your feelings or make you feel bad. But I'm able to kind of push past that and then look at the next issue. And that's what we need to do to get things done, is we need to trust each other and realize that, we really do all want things to go right for Vermonters. And we just have to figure out how can we make that happen together.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that, Michelle. I think one thing I'm sitting with right now is there's so much I agree with you there. And I also find it very fascinating what people will do when it's anonymous.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And I have had like hate comments on social media and stuff like that, really quite harsh things, actually. So sometimes, there's parts of it, but I think I have pretty thick skin. It's like I think the people that are writing those comments are not the people that are really that closely involved in my life. They don't show up at my community meetings. I mean, my community meetings, when people show up and I say, hey, come to the library and talk to me, the people who come, for the most part, are happy to listen and ask questions and hear my explanations. And it's usually very cooperative, mm-hmm. not that we all agree 100%, but it's very respectful. I've never had a disrespectful person show up at a community meeting. And those are the people that are working more constructively than the one who write a one-off nasty comment on social media.
Well, again, thank you for sharing that. It's giving me a lot to think about right now. Let's, in the interest of time, though, let's segue to a couple of the bills you worked on that maybe didn't get as much media attention than some of the other bills this session. And I'm going to start with H167, which did pass, was signed by the governor in May. So it is also known as Act 34, or as you call it, Vermonters Feeding Vermonters, which is it looks like a new grant program to support the food bank and also local food producers.
It's actually not a new program, but it's new that it's in statute. So it's actually been funded since, I believe, 2018. Okay. But a lot of it was funded initially through philanthropy. Some of it, I think, came from Jeff Bezos' ex-wife and other large philanthropists that gave money to the food bank. And they were able to fund this program, which has been funded to the point of around $2 million or a little more than $2 million a year since 2018. And last year, I think it was funded to 2.3 million, something like that. But it was never in statute. It was always year by year, and then it would be figured out. And so we wanted to get it in and have it as a line item on the budget to make sure that we could support this important program. And basically the premise of the program is that the Vermont Food Bank will contract with all kinds of different local farmers, both farmers that grow produce and also ones that make protein. So people that grow meat or that raise meat or dairy. And they will guarantee they're going to buy a certain number of products from those different types of farmers. And then they'll also be subcontracted out through partners of the food bank who will distribute that to food insecure individuals. So the farmers get a stable market and a guarantee income for a certain amount of their product. And then food insecure individuals get access to local good quality foods, meat, milk, and produce. And often the food that's available at food banks is not always those things. A lot of what people get at food banks is processed food or rice or pasta sauce. But if you want fresh produce, it's a little more limited. And so this is a win-win. It helps our farmers and it helps food insecure individuals. Now, the sad part of this bill is while it did pass, it passed with 25% of the funding out of the state that we were asking for. So we had asked for $2 million to come from the state budget. And when it was funded with $500,000. So not as many farmers will have their products supported and not as many people will have access to those foods. But is it an important program? It absolutely is. And I'm really, really pleased that we were able to get it through and get it with funding because there were many, many worthy programs that didn't make it with any funding this year. And so I was grateful to be able to have this move forward. And it's a good start to get it in statute, to have it as our policy. Hopefully in other years, we'll be able to figure out how to put more funding in again. Because I really do think it's an important program for both farms and for people that need healthy food.
Mm-hmm. And, that's one thing I always find interesting when I've reported on local food is it often has seemed that you've got multiple groups. You got the farmers who can make the food, and you got the people who probably want the food or need the food. Mm-hmm. But it is that distribution in between that often is where things get hung up, it seems. Yeah. And what is it about having the distribution hub be the food bank that works so well in this situation?
Well, I mean, they were the ones that started the program in 2018. And so I think it's continued to be funded through them just because they have a network of connection through different food hubs and other food distributors to get the food to the people, to the people that need it. And so they've been good partners in this program all the way through. And the Department of Agriculture is actually involved a little bit in that as well, in terms of finding the farmers. And so the Department of Agriculture, the food bank, and the food bank partners, they all work together and we're able to support food and food insecure individuals.
Mm-hmm. I also noticed something when I was looking through the legislation, and I hope I say this right, that subgranting for local food, but also culturally relevant foods.
There's a very small amount of the grant that goes to fund CSA shares for individuals in some communities. So for example, I don't know about this year, but I know last year in our community in, Windham County, there's a farm called the Susu Collective, and they grow a lot of diverse foods and some culturally specific foods. And part of the grant funds for this program actually go to provide CSA shares for individuals who want to get CSA shares through that farm. So it's that kind of thing. So there are some opportunities for, in addition to the food bank distribution, there are a few examples around the state of these kind of product farm programs that provide goods to particular populations. Mm-hmm. So it's a small amount of the grant, but it is a part of the grant.
Thank you. What else? Anything else about this grant you want to mention? Because you did say this one received funding when so many things didn't.
Right. Well, I mean, I just think in general, even though we didn't actually pass a lot of bills related to food and agriculture this session, we passed some, but we didn't pass a lot. But this was probably our biggest accomplishment, I think, in terms of something that both benefits farmers and people who need food. And so that's a win-win. But we did actually pass some other legislation that was related to in terms of getting fresh food to food insecure individuals. There's a program called Crop Cash,
Oh,
which
yeah.
basically takes individuals who get 3 squares, and if they take their funds and they take them to farmers markets, they can get twice as much produce as if they just used it in the regular grocery store. And so this is another way that it's supporting the direct produce from local producers. So it helps the local farmers, and then it helps the people that are using those coupons to get more produce for their, for the income that they've got. And so we did support that. We supported actually another aspect of that, which is called Crop Cash Plus, which also enables things like dairy and meat products as well within farmers market contexts. So
Hmm.
we really did do good work, I think, with a limited ability to fund things. We tried to put policies in which would benefit people to provide the food system and the people that need access to good food. Because the truth is, people who are wealthy are going to figure out how to get the food that they want. People that aren't wealthy are going to have fewer options. And we want all Vermonters to be able to eat, and we want the farmers who are feeding all of us to be able to keep making a living as farmers, or else none of us are going to get that local food. I don't think anybody wants to only eat food that, like, our apples have to be shipped in from Washington State because the farmers can't make it here. We want our farmers to make it here. And the policies that we worked on this year, they help food insecure individuals, but they really help all of us, including the farmers. And I feel really good about that.
Thank you. I'd love to shift gears to another piece of legislation. This one is S, as in Senate,
Mm-hmm.
60,
Yep.
and it's a farm security special fund
Yep.
that was supposed to provide grants for to farms that lost produce or animals due to weather.
True.
Um, and I believe that's in House Appropriations now. It didn't pass.
It's true. We were actually expecting that that was going to pass. This bill was one that's been really one that we've been asked for by people all over the state. I mean, I don't think there's a Vermonter around who's lived here for more than 2 years who isn't aware of the massive flooding that we've had in recent years. And also in the last few years, we've also had some other extreme weather events, such as late frosts. We had a frost that happened in May, which killed 90% of the peach crop in Vermont about 2 or 3 years ago. And if you're a farmer that makes a bunch of your money from selling peaches, that's a huge loss. And a lot of those micro crops like that, you can't insure. So if you lose that crop, you just lose your income for that year. And so again, if we want to have local access to a variety of foods, we need to figure out how can we help farmers stay afloat when they have these adverse weather situations. So this was a priority for NOFA Vermont, the Northeast Organic Farmers Association. It was a priority also for other farming groups around the state. They're like, we really want to have this security fund, which if something happens that impacts a crop in a given year, the farmers can go to the state and they can get funds to help to rebuild, to damage control, so that maybe they can do some remediation and still salvage or replant or do something that will enable them to make some funds this year. And the original ask was for $20 million. And when the bill left the Senate, which is where it started, it still had $7 million in it. When it was voted, I believe it was voted out of the Senate Ag Committee with $7 million as the recommended funding amount. And then the Appropriations Committee in the Senate didn't send it with an amount, just like what often happens is the Appropriations Committee decides they're going to come up with their own amount. They're not going to pass anything with a particular amount. So it did pass unanimously through the Senate, came to our committee, passed unanimously out of our committee. And when we sent it to appropriations, we were hoping we could get, I think, $2 million at that point. We were like, you know what? We realize there isn't a lot of money, but we want to at least get this started. We want to set up this fund. And the idea with this fund is that it would be more time responsive than, for example, with FEMA. There's still people that are waiting from 2 years ago to get funds from when their fields flooded 2 years ago.
Good point.
Well, a lot of people go bankrupt before they get the funds from that.
Mm-hmm.
And so the hope was this isn't going to happen to the same farmers again and again. There were all kinds of careful safety provisions where if you're growing in a floodplain, you might need to think about where are you going to grow. You can't just again and again get bailed out by the state. That was not the way the bill was written. It was written very carefully to target unusual situations and also help people to move to to planting in ways that's going to have them have the greatest success. but to get bailed out when there's a surprising struggle. And what happened was that by the time it got to appropriations, we thought it was still going to pass out. And I had my floor speech. I presented H167. I was going to present S60 on the floor as well. I had my speech ready. I was all ready to go. And then it didn't get voted out of appropriations, and it didn't get voted out of appropriations. And all these other things started coming in. This was the very end of the session. And about the last week, it became clear. They said, we don't have funds to vote this out right now. And so we had talked about, could you vote it out that, yes, we approve this policy and just do it without any money, so that we could set up, basically there was going to be a board that included some farmers, some people from the Department of Agriculture, some other people that were farm affiliated, who would be making decisions about these dispersals, so that perhaps if there was a philanthropic donation, or if the state in the future is able to donate it, we don't have to start from ground zero, or from the beginning, to get the infrastructure set up to do the distribution. But appropriation said, you know what, we don't want to pass this out if we're not able to pass it with some money. We're going to wait. So our hope is that it will still pass. Mm-hmm. And, we were able to get H167 through with limited funding this year. Our hope is maybe we'll be able to get S60 through next year as well. But it's hard to say, because there are an extraordinary number of needs in our state in terms of housing and medical care and all these other things that cost money. And we'll just have to wait and see. I do hope that it can go through. I do think it's important. And we have a lot of farms that are going bankrupt because they can't stay afloat when they have an adverse weather situation. And we don't want that. We want farmers who want to farm, we want them to be able to keep going. We have all these goals to increase local food production, but it's very hard to make a living being a farmer. At least a small scale farmer. And we have a lot of those in Vermont, and we want to keep them. So I'm hoping that we can get this through next year to help people in those difficult situations.
And we should remind folks that since we're at the halfway point of the biennium, just because this bill didn't pass out, it's still alive.
It's absolutely still alive, and we have until, who knows, May or June of next year for it to pass.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, Michelle. I don't know if you can speak to this, but I think for a lot of people, they look at farming and the economics of it just either doesn't factor into their thought processes or at all, or they just have very limited knowledge at how complicated running a business like a farm can be. I'm curious, when you look at the landscape of farming in Vermont, and I'm using farming very widely. I'm not just thinking of dairy or produce or whatever. Where are you seeing the strengths, but also where are the challenges?
The truth is there are challenges everywhere. There are a lot of farmers, particularly smaller farmers, are having especially hard go of it. I worked this last year in a UVM ag extension job in my other job, and took students from Brattleboro to learn about farming and other food-related careers. And I visited some farms with them, including a dairy farm. And the dairy farmer told us, and I heard this in testimony in the State House as well, most small dairy farmers barely come out ahead. The cost of milk that they're paid for by the federal price point, they barely are able to stay afloat. So the way that people are able to make more money, particularly in dairy, is by getting huge. And when you get huge, then you don't have as good of conditions for the animals. They don't get to go outside as much. They don't have as much pasture time. And that's complicated. I think most people in Vermont would like to see animals well cared for and people getting good quality food. And that's tricky. The smaller farms, the way that they can make a go of it is by diversifying. So if somebody traditionally has started out just growing crops, if they grow crops and then maybe they make pesto, or they have a small dairy and then they open a creamy stand, they can stay afloat because they come up with these creative solutions.
Multiple income streams.
Absolutely. So if you go to a farm stand or you go to a farmer's market and you see a farmer and they've got some interesting, funky little product, support it. That's gonna keep them afloat, because just producing the vegetables, the berries, the dairy, it's not easy for many farmers to stay afloat just with those primary products unless they're on a very, very large scale. And there aren't that many huge farmers in Vermont, particularly the vegetable and fruit ones. They really have to work on a small scale doing a variety of different things, making jelly or maple syrup or other kinds of things.
Thank you.
But supporting local does really make a difference. So, I mean, people say, like, oh my gosh, why is that so expensive? Well, it's expensive because it's hard to make a living. It's hard to make a living. And if we want to have those products locally, we need to support the farmers that are growing them.
hmm I remember hearing a food producer once say that a lot of times with local food, you're actually seeing the real price of what it takes to, really big companies can, take from this pot and take from this pot and put this here and put this
Yeah.
here when it comes to their economics, where
Yeah.
local, what you see is what you get quite often.
Yeah.
We have just a few minutes left before we wrap this episode, Michelle. I wonder if there's anything else you want to let listeners know about, any other pieces of legislation perhaps that didn't get a lot of attention, but you'd like to mention?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the only one that really comes to mind that I'm really disappointed that we weren't able to get through and go to the other side is H91, which was the emergency housing bill.
Yeah.
I've worked as a case manager and in social services at different points in my life, including with folks in Southern Vermont who were unhoused, who lived in hotels and were trying to transition into other places. And I know personally that there are not housing options for those folks. It is very, very difficult to find housing options for those folks. And trying to find housing takes months and months and even years and years. And so we came up with, we being the Human Services Committee in the House, and then it actually passed all the way through the House and the Senate, came up with this plan to try and transition the system to provide bigger shelters that could provide more supports to eventually transition people out. And when the governor vetoed it, we didn't have a way to override the veto. There weren't the votes to override the veto. And so there's no other plan. And I find that really, really discouraging because we have a lot of people that don't have housing. We have a lot of people that don't have housing at all levels. But for people who are unhoused, it's particularly ominous. And keeping people living in hotels is not a good option for anybody. It's expensive and it's also not stable and it doesn't have good supports. I mean, I was a case manager in that program and I would try to meet with people once a week, but that's not enough to transition people into a stable position. And it's really discouraging that after all these years and all these different things we've tried, a full plan was ready. The governor said no, and now there's no other plan. The governor doesn't have another plan. We don't have another plan. So now we're going through a whole nother season, including the next winter, where we're going to have a bunch of folks that are going to have no choice but to stay in the hotels. Because I also don't feel good about saying people can't stay in a hotel because it's too expensive, because the alternative is going outside and people die outside.
Mhm.
And so that the emergency housing situation is really frustrating for me. I mean, that wasn't my first choice actually of committee this year. Was I wanted to be on human services and I wanted to work on those issues. It turned out I got assigned to agriculture instead. And I'm actually super glad that I was in agriculture. I had a very positive experience there, but it does kind of break my heart that we weren't able to make more a more successful outcome on that issue of what we're going to do to help unhoused folks transition out of the hotels. That was pretty heartbreaking.
Mm. I am sure I will come across someone who will agree with the governor's decision to veto H91. I have yet to meet that person. And what you've said has echoed what a lot of people have said. I think what was hard for me watching H91 be vetoed is, yeah, quite often what I would hear from people is, we need a plan. Why don't we have a plan? We need a bigger long-term strategy, all those sorts of things. We need to do away with this program. And it does seem, at least on the surface, that H91 did a lot of those things. And so it is a little bit mind-boggling that we didn't move forward with it as a state.
Yeah.
Here's fingers crossed we come up with something better.
Next year, I don't know if we can come up with something that will get across the line or not, but I sure hope so, because it's certainly a lingering need. That's a huge need. It's a
Mhm.
huge need, and it has both financial and human ramifications.
Yeah. Well, Michelle Bos-Lun, Representative for Wyndham 3, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your thoughts with listeners. Really appreciate it. If people do want to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
I think probably the best way would be write to me through my legislative email, which is, it's all the same formula for all of us. But if you go to the Vermont Legislature website, you'll see my email on there. If you email me, you'll see actually if I respond to you, my phone number is on there as well. If you want to try and have a phone conversation, but I think an email is probably a good way to start the conversation. Let me know what the issues are you want to touch base on, and especially for farmers in Windham County or Windsor County, I would actually love to visit some farms and talk to folks about agricultural issues. If people have particular things they'd like to see happen in the legislature related to farming and food issues, absolutely get in touch. I'd like to have some more experience with those issues before we go back.
Wonderful. Well, Michelle Bos-Lun, thank you for joining us. And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW LP Brattleboro every Friday at 2, rebroadcasted on Wednesdays and wherever you find your podcasts. Thank you so much, everyone.